are in listen-only.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientists monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host and moderator for today's webinar. Today, Dr. Edward Selby will present Emotional Cascades and Understanding the Chaos and Complexity of Borderline Personality Disorder. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation funds research around the world that identifies the causes in order to improve treatments for mental illness. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $328 million in research grants. We are the largest funder of mental health grants outside the federal government. And 100% of all donor contributions for research are invested in these research grants. Our researchers are working to find scientific breakthroughs in brain and behavior disorders such as ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, OCD, PTSD, and schizophrenia. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Edward Selby. Dr. Selby is Assistant Professor of Clinical Psychology at Rutgers University and the recipient of a 2012 NARSAD Young Investigator Grant. Dr. Selby specializes in research and treatment of suicidal and self-injurious behavior, personality disorders, and eating disorders. A major focus of his research on these disorders involves emotional dysregulation and the use of self-sabotaging behaviors to distract from dealing with upsetting emotions. Today's webinar will begin with Dr. Selby's presentation. This will be followed by questions and answers. To submit a question, please use the Questions tab on the control panel on your screen. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. Following the presentation, I'll present your questions to Dr. Selby, and we will address as many of them as possible. And now, I'm pleased to present Dr. Edward Selby. Eddie, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be speaking to you today. Let's make sure I've got this up. Great. It's such a pleasure to be speaking to so many people around the world today. I'm going to be talking about borderline personality disorder today, which is a complex disorder that to people with the disorder and to their family and friends and others around them can seem like a very chaotic condition. But as we'll see, we've developed the science quite a bit over the last decade or so, particularly pinpointing the role of a process called emotional cascades in driving much of these behaviors. For those of you who aren't familiar with borderline personality disorder, it's a disorder that involves quite frequently, let's see if I can get it to come up. There it is, okay. It's a disorder that quite frequently involves turbulent emotional experiences. These individuals can get extremely upset, much more so than the average individual in the same scenario. This often results from things that might seem very minor, but can result in an extreme emotional response. They also display frequent problems with dysregulated behaviors. These behaviors can include things such as aggressive behavior, substance use, self-injurious behavior, or even eating disordered behaviors. Borderline personality disorder is a disorder that also causes a lot of suffering, and because of that, it's a disorder with an elevated suicide rate. Many of these individuals end up struggling throughout their lives, and unfortunately a number end up losing their life due to suicide. Another related concern with this is self-injurious behavior, which I'll get to in a moment. And then another aspect of this disorder involves stormy interpersonal relationships, where they're often having very chaotic interactions with other people, including family members, friends, and romantic relationships. Now, my research focuses very heavily on the first two aspects up here, turbulent emotions and dysregulated behaviors, which we'll see, I think, are the core of this disorder and drive much of the problems that people experience with the disorder. Now, I'm going to diverge here for a moment and talk a little bit about self-injury. Now, self-injury is a disorder that's gaining more and more public awareness and is a very prominent behavior in many Western settings. This behavior involves purposely cutting, burning, hitting, pinching, or severely scratching oneself without any desire for dying by suicide. So they're doing it without attempting to kill themselves. And this disorder can seem very mysterious at first, but fortunately it's a behavior that we've learned much about over the years. Now, self-injury is a behavior that can be found quite frequently in people with borderline personality disorder, although it's not necessarily exclusive to borderline personality disorder. I want to take a moment and go ahead and poll the audience to kind of get a sense of what the general audience's understanding of self-injurious behavior is. So you should see a poll popping up on your screen now, and I'm going to read out to you the question as well as the answers. If you have a moment, I'd like you to go ahead and answer the question, just giving it your best effort from what you know. Why do people engage in self-injury without suicidal intent? Please select one of the following: to get out of doing something boring, to feel a rush of excitement, to get attention from someone they love, or to escape from emotional distress. So now, go ahead and take a moment to think about each of these options, and when you can, go ahead and select one. The poll will close here in about 20 to 30 seconds, and then what I will do is I'll reveal what the general audience thinks is the sort of primary reason that people engage in self-injury, and then I'll explain to you what the answer is and why. So go ahead and finish up voting if you can. And let's see. Now I see on my screen that 0% reported selected getting out of something boring, so good for you, audience. Only 2% reported getting a rush or feeling of excitement. 4% reported to get attention from someone they love. And then 93% of you said to escape feelings of emotional distress. So the correct answer is D, although it's a little bit of a trick question in that people report all of these reasons. But the key here is that the primary reason that the majority of people who self-injure report is answer D, to escape feelings of emotional distress. Answer B also happens more commonly, which is to get a feeling of rush or excitement. The other two, which involve social reasons, happen but are much less common than the other two. To highlight this, I've got some graphs displayed on the screen for you, and these are from some of our ongoing research in our lab, where we have adolescent self-injurers take our smartphone app and use it during their daily lives. And when they engage in self-injury, they report how they were feeling before and how they were feeling after the self-injury. And what you can see here is that after self-injury, they felt a decrease in negative emotion, so they felt less upset after self-injuring, and an increase in positive emotion after self-injuring. And you can see these emotions broken down below you. Now, this is sort of interesting because it's sort of a paradox. Why would somebody, when they're feeling really upset about something, physically hurt themselves to feel better? And that has been a central theme to this, to my research on not only self-injury, but other behavioral problems that are associated with borderline personality disorder. Now, to place the work that I do on borderline personality disorder in context, I want to show sort of where the field stands for borderline personality disorder. As you can see here, we've established that there's a number of vulnerabilities that many people have, either genetic vulnerabilities, biological vulnerabilities, or social familial vulnerabilities, growing up in a challenging family or in a bad neighborhood. And what we found that these various vulnerabilities increase the prediction of later development of psychopathology, things like borderline personality disorder, self-injury or suicidal behavior, and eating disordered behavior. But one of the challenges in research is we don't really understand how someone goes from having a vulnerability to developing the disorder. So we have a big black box of what's in between. Well, my work attempts to establish what takes these vulnerabilities and turns it into the disorder through emotional mechanisms. So people have these vulnerabilities, experience changes in emotions and behavior that ultimately leads to the development of these conditions like borderline personality disorder. One of the primary mechanisms we've looked at with this involves what we've called emotional cascades. So an emotional cascade is an emotional experience that we found tends to be very unique for people with extreme impulsive behaviors and particularly borderline personality disorder. And it typically starts with the experience of an emotion, typically a negative emotion. This could be due to a variety of things, getting some bad news, getting a bad grade on a test, being criticized about something. Some of these things we may understand. We would also, as a broad population, feel upset about these events. But sometimes they can be perceived problems as well, as thinking maybe somebody meant something or reading in between the lines with the situation. So this leads to negative emotion. And where we think people with BPD differ from other people is that people with BPD tend to ruminate on these upsetting problems. Now, rumination is a term that you might not be familiar with, but what it refers to is repeatedly thinking about an upsetting problem, the causes and the consequences of that problem over and over and over, sort of chewing on it and not letting it go. And what we've found is that when people ruminate, and this applies to people with depression, people with borderline personality disorder, and a number of other conditions, they tend to experience an increased emotional intensity. By ruminating, it makes them more upset. But what we've also found is that as people get more upset, they tend to engage in more rumination. So what we think is happening with people with BPD is they're ruminating about a problem, making themselves more upset, and as a result, they're thinking even more intensely and more frustratingly about the problem. And this continues to build until they've reached what we've called an emotional cascade, which is an extremely intense and very painful emotional experience that's very difficult to tolerate. Now, it's during an emotional cascade that we think many of these individuals engage in what we call dysregulated behaviors. Once again, a dysregulated behavior could be something like self-injury, using a substance, binge eating or other eating disordered behaviors, getting into a physical fight or yelling, a variety of different behaviors. Now, what we think is that these different behaviors all have in common a potent physical sensation. So it could be the pain in self-injury, or sometimes people report viewing the blood as something that draws them to self-injury, using a substance, the physical effects of the substance, or binge eating on food, feeling the effects of fullness, tasting the food. All of these provide very strong physical sensations. And what these physical sensations do, we think, is interfere with this rumination component. It allows people to focus away from ruminating about the problem and onto the physical sensations. What that then does is short circuits the emotional cascade and makes it go away. And then that's often associated with feelings of relief. They've gotten rid of this extremely painful experience, and now they're feeling relieved because of this. So just to sort of highlight our initial investigations into emotional cascades, and if people with BPD have them, one of the first experiments we did was called a rumination induction. And in this rumination induction, we brought in people with BPD and people without BPD, and then we had them engage in a 5-minute task where they thought about a personally relevant, upsetting situation. And we encouraged them to think as much and deeply about the causes and consequences of that problem as possible. And what you see graphed before you are the before and after results of this induction. So as we can see here, the yellow bars were with the before group, with this being the BPD group. And as you can see here, the BPD group was much more upset right off the bat than the control group. Maybe they just didn't want to come in for the experiment, they were annoyed, who knows. Now, after the 5-minute rumination induction, what we saw was that people with BPD, once again, were more upset than people without BPD. But what's really important in a task like this is the amount of change from before to after, because that gives us an index of reactivity to this task. And when we compared the two groups, we can see here that the BPD group was much more upset after this task than the control group. So what that means is that even just asking these individuals with BPD to think about an upsetting problem, they responded much more intensely than the control group. And these numbers here, what's important is to show that this is a medium effect, which means that they responded pretty decently strongly to a task that involved them just thinking about a problem, let alone actually experiencing a problem. Now, I want to take a moment and talk about current research that we're doing in our lab. And one of our big projects, which was funded by the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, as well as the Families for Borderline Personality Disorder research, involves taking this previous task with rumination induction and then comparing people with BPD to other disorders such as depression or bulimia, and then also at the same time measuring their physiological responses, which you can see displayed up here. So this would be measuring their blood pressure, their heart rate, how much electricity is in their skin. And what we're hoping to show with this project is that people with BPD show not only a greater psychological response of getting upset, but also a greater physiological response, showing that it's both this sort of body reaction as well as a psychological reaction. We're still working on the data for that, so I don't have that to show you today, but I have plenty of other good things. Building on our experimental research with borderline personality disorder, we've also been working on more real world. How do we get into the real world of people with BPD and measure emotional cascades and see how those influence behaviors? One of the ways we do that is with a technique called experience sampling. In this technique, people carry a Palm Pilot, which is now sort of a defunct technology. Now we're using more smartphone apps, but a lot of the initial research was done with these Palm Pilots. People would carry this around, and it would beep them 5 to 6 times per day, and then they would respond to the questions of how are you feeling? What kind of behaviors have you engaged in? Have you had any interpersonal interactions that were problematic? And they would respond to this multiple times per day. Now, when we did this with a study of 50 people who were very impulsive, many of which had borderline personality disorder, we uncovered a number of behaviors. So a number of people reported alcohol use, reckless driving, self-injury, impulsive shopping, substance use, binge eating, and some physical fighting and aggressive behavior. So people were reporting a lot of these problematic behaviors. And what we wanted to show was that emotional cascades experienced now will predict a future behavioral problem. So the way we looked at this was we looked at one signal. How does someone feel or thinking at this one signal predict a future signal? So I'll come back to that. So how does someone feeling now, does that predict their engaging in substance use, binge eating behavior, or self-injury 2 to 3 hours down the road? And what we found was that the more people were ruminating about a problem, or the more negative emotion they had, the more likely they were to engage in these behaviors. So we were essentially predicting their behavior out in the real world, that the more upset they got, the more likely they would be to engage in these behaviors. Now what we see here is that this effect was even larger for those with borderline personality disorder. What you can see here is this top line, as indicated by the orange arrow. Those are people with BPD, and the more someone with BPD was ruminating about a problem and the more upset they were feeling about the problem, the more likely they were to engage in one of these different behaviors. In fact, it was going to be almost 90% that they would do one of these behaviors. So once again, we were able to show that people, the way they were feeling, predicted their future behavior. Now, another way of looking at emotional cascades is done with what we call the instability of rumination. Now, this is sort of a tricky concept to understand, and the best way to sort of discuss it is by looking at a graph. So here we have someone's rumination levels over time. Down here is different recordings, so recording 1 through recording 70, and each time they reported how much they were ruminating. And what you see is they have some peaks and some missing points is where they didn't respond, but they're kind of going up and down. Now, this person would be classified as being stable in their rumination, even if it doesn't quite look like it. Let's compare that to someone with borderline personality disorder. So we see right here that by comparison, they're all over the place. They're having these huge bursts of rumination and calming back down, huge bursts of rumination and calming back down. And what you can see with these little plus signs here are when they engage in dysregulated behavior. So it's kind of like they're experiencing this burst of rumination, engaging in dysregulated behavior, calming down. So you can see that they're much more unstable in terms of their rumination experience, much more so than an average or stable person. Now I have a second poll for the audience, and I'm going to go ahead and read this out loud to you. But I just kind of want to get a sense of what people's understanding of borderline personality disorder is and what the treatment for it can be. So people with BPD should be able to control their emotions just as well as anyone else if they put their mind to it. True or false, and remember there's no wrong answer, we're just trying to get a sense of sort of general perceptions of this disorder, and then I will read the results once they show up. So another 20 seconds or so, and then we'll present the results of the poll. So if you haven't done so already, go ahead and select an option and submit your results for the poll, and then I will read them out. Okay, so about 12% of the audience said that that was true, that people can control their emotions just as well as anyone else, whereas 88% said that that was false. The answer is false. And what I mean when I say that is that individuals with BPD experience extreme emotions, much more so than someone without BPD can often sort of appreciate or understand. They often have many vulnerabilities that result in them experiencing emotion in a much more raw and intense way than often family members understand. But the good news is that with a lot of practice and learning healthy skills for emotion regulation, people with BPD can learn to manage these intense emotions, though it's often going to be a challenge for them for a long time. Now I want to take a moment and talk a little bit about some recent directions my lab has been taking in this research, in particularly looking at what's called the butterfly effect, which I'm sure a number of you have heard of before if you've seen Jurassic Park. So the butterfly effect is a topic that comes to us from chaos theory, and it's more precisely known as sensitive dependence on initial conditions. To make it easier for people, it's good to think of it as it's a compounding effect, where even small differences can lead to very extreme outcomes. Let me give you an example. Here we have sort of your typical investment to time compounding interest graph. So what we see here is the bottom graph down here is time over years, so 0 to 25 years, and then the amount of an investment ranging from 10,000 to 100,000. So we have three different initial investments here. We have somebody who didn't invest very much, somebody who invested a little bit more, and then somebody who invested quite a bit or more, but not necessarily that much more. And what happens is with compounding interest over time, this money grows. So you can see the person who didn't really invest that much at the start didn't really have that much more after 25 years, versus the person who invested just a few thousand more at the start had substantially more money at the end of 25 years because of compounding interest. So what we see here is that even just small differences in the start resulted in major outcome differences over time. So how is this relevant to borderline personality disorder? Well, in some people, we see an extremely strong and sensitive connection between negative thoughts and negative emotions, particularly those with BPD. So we've been looking at the butterfly effect in BPD to try and demonstrate this. One way we've looked at this is, once again, with experience sampling research. And in this research, we looked at, again, how are they feeling right now? So they're what's often called lag rumination. So how were they feeling a few hours ago? Were they ruminating a lot, and did they have a lot of negative emotion? And did that predict even higher levels of rumination and negative emotion 2 to 3 hours later? Well, what we found is graphed out here for you, and I'll walk you through these graphs because they can be a little bit hard to digest. But what we've got here is lag rumination, which was how they were ruminating a few hours ago, and their current rumination in the future. So time 1, time 2. And what we see here is that people, the more they were ruminating at the start, the more that compounded over the next 2 to 3 hours to make them even more upset. We can see the same thing down here with lag rumination predicting later rumination. The more they were ruminating a few hours ago, the more intensely they were ruminating a few hours later. Now, I'm sure this graph can be a bit tricky, but let me sort of give you a way to think of this. People often who don't have this problem, like family members, clinicians, friends, would tend to be in this lower line down here. So maybe they got really, they were thinking about a problem, they were getting upset, but it didn't necessarily make them that much more upset. Where somebody with BPD would be more along this upper line, where the more they thought about this problem, the more it exponentially made them more upset. Particularly down here, you can see this dramatic effect of sort of going off the charts with their emotion and rumination. Similarly, when we look at negative emotion and later rumination, we can see that once again, the person with that tended not to have BPD got, they got more ruminative the more they got upset. But once again, the person with BPD is shooting off the charts here because they're experiencing such an extreme compounding effect of their emotions and their thoughts. So the takeaway from this is that they sort of get into this feedback loop that makes them more and more upset and more focused on the thoughts about the problem they're having, that it results in a really extreme emotional response. Now, once again, this applies to the behaviors that those people are reporting. So we looked at the rumination and negative emotion before and a future dysregulated behavior 2 to 3 hours later. And once again, we see the same effect. People down here with lower experience with this, they didn't really shoot much up. Even if they were ruminating a lot about a problem, they weren't necessarily going to engage in a dysregulated behavior. People with BPD, on the other hand, shot off the charts in terms of now they were going to, because they were so upset, it led them into an emotional cascade, and then they engaged in a dysregulated behavior. And you can see the same down here. So this is, the purpose of this is to show that oftentimes for family members or clinicians or friends, even when we, without this disorder, might get really upset, it doesn't make us as prone to engage in these behaviors because we're not as experiencing this dramatic experience and emotion that the people with BPD are. So it sort of can help to understand why people might become so upset over something that might have seemed so small at the start. So the takeaway of this research is that we were able to show that the butterfly effect applies to borderline personality disorder, and it suggests once again that these emotional cascades are driving a lot of this emotional chaos in people with BPD's lives. This same effect of having these emotional cascades is also part of what appears to be driving their dysregulated behaviors like self-injury, binge eating, substance use, etc. This part here where dysregulated behavior may serve as an attractor point, what that means is that people with BPD tend to become so upset as a result of this process that oftentimes the only thing they can think of to make themselves feel better and to get rid of this painful experience is a dysregulated behavior. So that's often the challenge with the disorders. How do we help individuals with BPD calm down and manage these intense emotions in a way that's healthy without those problematic behaviors? Now, when I've been talking about emotional cascades, I've been talking about them on sort of, you have an emotional experience, someone has an emotional cascade, they engage in dysregulated behavior. That's sort of one sequence of events. But it's important to understand that borderline personality disorder and emotional cascades exist in a very broad environment with a lot of things going on and a lot of things contributing to the disorder in addition to emotional cascades. So we got to take the small to the large. And one way we've done that in our lab is by doing some theoretical work on trying to understand how borderline personality disorder emerges from the experience of emotional cascades. Now, emergence is a topic that also comes from the chaos and complexity literature, and what it's trying to say is that an emergent phenomenon is something that is more than just the sum of its parts. Let me give you an example. An ecosystem, it consists of a whole variety of things like water, precipitation, plant and animal life, the amount of sun that it's getting, the geography and the climate. And all of that interacts in a way that creates what we think of as an ecosystem. All of these little pieces are contributing in an interacting way to create this larger experience. Well, we think the same thing applies to borderline personality disorder. And so what I've got here is sort of what we think is the heart of this whole experience, where people are having emotional cascades, and then they're engaging in dysregulated behaviors. And this is often contributed to by a variety of other things, so things like biological vulnerabilities, environmental vulnerabilities, and different cognitive vulnerabilities. Now, I've just highlighted a couple here to try and keep this model, which is going to get big in a second, to keep it more focused. So we've got over here what's called invalidation and criticism from others. Oftentimes people with BPD live in environments where they're getting criticized a lot, whether it's by people at work, by friends, or by family members. And oftentimes this is very legitimate criticism in terms of somebody saying something that would upset pretty much anyone. On the other hand, a lot of times this can also be perceived, where somebody sort of reads into the way someone was acting or reads into what was said. So it's sort of a perceived invalidation. Now, on the other hand, people with BPD often have distorted cognitions and views of others. So they often have thoughts like, you know, I'm not a good person, or I always mess things up, or people are always mean and out to get me. And so they have a number of these different thoughts, both of which are going to promote having emotional cascades. If you have these factors, they're likely to contribute to an emotional cascade experience and a subsequent dysregulated behavior. Now, there's a whole lot more going on in this model, which just got very big. But I once again want you to keep focused on what we think is sort of the heart of this model, the emotional cascades and the dysregulated behaviors, and then the two components that I was just highlighting, although the others are certainly relevant. So what we see is the experience of invalidation and criticism from others, or distorted cognitions and views of others, feeds into the experience of emotional cascades and promotes dysregulated behaviors. The more this happens over time, whoops, I went the wrong way. The more this happens over time, we start to see the emergence of what we think of as borderline personality disorder. People are acting in this sort of chaotic, emotional, behaviorally problematic way, and they start to develop what we think of as borderline personality disorder. But where this thinking of the disorder is really enhanced by this idea of emergence is once the disorder starts to emerge, it starts to make everything else worse. So by having this experience of having borderline personality disorder, it makes people more prone to even more invalidation and criticism. People might respond to them by saying, why do you always act so crazy? Why do you have to behave in such a bad way? Why can't you control yourself? And similarly, as a result of these experiences, they might start to develop more distorted thoughts about themselves or others. People are always going to yell at me, or I'm completely worthless and I can't behave myself in a way that works. And so basically the experience of borderline personality disorder starts making all the things that led to its development even worse. So it just shows how complex of a disorder this can be and why treatment can be such a challenge for individuals with BPD, because there's so many targets to try and help improve with the person that it's hard to figure out what's the one thing to do. So that's why I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the treatment implications of emotional cascades and this sort of model of understanding borderline personality disorder. And I think that there are numerous treatment implications as well as some sort of ways that can help families interacting with people with BPD. And I'm going to go through those now. The place I want to start at the moment is in discussing what's the leading treatment for borderline personality disorder is what's called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, which was created by Marshall Linehan and has shown over numerous studies to be extremely effective in treating borderline personality disorder. It's definitely the gold standard treatment for the disorder. However, I want to note that there are a number of other emerging treatments that are also showing important promise for borderline personality disorder, including transference-focused psychotherapy, minimalization-focused therapy, and schema-focused therapy. So a lot of these treatments are proving to be very important for helping people with borderline personality disorder. Now, where I think the emotional cascade model interfaces very nicely with dialectical behavior therapy is dialectical behavior therapy often says people with BPD they're emotional and they engage in problematic behaviors, but it doesn't necessarily say why some of the techniques used in DBT are helping those with BPD. And I have a number of thoughts on that. The first one being mindfulness. A major focus of DBT treatment for BPD involves the development of what were called mindfulness skills. Now, mindfulness is your ability to sort of step back from your thoughts, step back from your emotions, and observe them and just experience them without reacting to them. And oftentimes, many people, including myself, are not very mindful about their daily lives and their interpersonal interactions and their emotional experiences. A great example of this is driving. If you're like me, I'm often driving thinking about all the things I have to get done, what I'm going to have for dinner, what I'm going to do for the weekend, and I'm not being very mindful about paying attention to the traffic around me or making sure that I make a correct turn, etc. So the more someone can develop mindfulness skills, the more that they're focused on the present, and the more they can step back from emotions and experience them without reacting to them. Now, what our lab has shown is that people with BPD experience deficits in mindfulness as a function of rumination. So what this means is part of the reason they're not very mindful about things is because they're ruminating on a regular basis about a variety of different problems. Now, why would teaching someone to be more mindful help reduce an emotional cascade? Well, the thinking is that if someone can engage in mindfulness, it gets them to stop feeding into the rumination cycle in an emotional cascade, and it helps prevent them from going into the full-blown emotional cascade and sort of stops it at a cognitive level as opposed to letting it go full-blown and lead to a problem behavior. So mindfulness is a great skill for anyone to learn, but especially people with BPD. Another major focus of dialectical behavior therapy is helping people with BPD engage in activities that are considered more healthy than the dysregulated behaviors they tend to engage in. So DBT helps coach these individuals to come up with a variety of different healthy coping activities. So exercise often tends to be one of the most promising, but I think there's a variety of other activities that can be done. But the key is when someone with BPD starts to become upset, that is when they need to start engaging in these alternative activities, because these activities help distract them from an emotional cascade. So the sooner someone, when they become upset, can engage in a distracting activity as opposed to going into a full-blown emotional cascade, the easier it's going to be to manage that negative emotion. Some of the things I often recommend, and these are still sort of preliminary and we haven't gotten a lot of research done on this, but things that I think would be particularly good for this include both puzzles and games. So I have here Sudoku puzzle and a crossword puzzle. And the reason I suggest puzzles to help distract from an upsetting emotional experience is because to solve one of these puzzles, you really have to focus on the puzzle and really be sort of completely mindful about the puzzle as opposed to drifting off and thinking about upsetting problems if you want to have any chance of completing it. So it's a very engaging and engrossing activity that has a good chance of sort of short-circuiting the emotional cascade right away. One of the things that I think is really great for anyone, but including younger people who often have smartphones and a variety of smartphone apps, is to pull out your smartphone and pull out a smartphone app game like Angry Birds here or Tetris. And it might seem like kind of a silly idea that if you're feeling upset about something that just happened, well, go attack some pigs with Angry Birds. But what happens is it's a very engaging and fun game, and by playing in that for a little bit, it can help distract from the emotional experience that someone's having and give them a chance to calm down from an emotional cascade without going all the way into engaging in a dysregulated behavior. So I think this is a really promising future avenue and a way that we can sort of reach out and engage younger patients in treatment as well. Now, there are some other clinical applications that I want to mention with this research, and this is a really growing area of concern for people with BPD. It involves sleep problems. More and more research is showing that people with BPD have a number of sleep problems, even beyond things like depression or anxiety disorders. And we think that, at least I think that this makes sense when you think about this tendency toward emotional cascades. For example, one study we did recently showed that people with BPD reported significant problems with insomnia at night, and especially initial insomnia, where they were having trouble falling asleep at night, or even they were waking up in the middle of the night because of concerns. So we think that once again this could be due to rumination or emotional cascades. They're trying to go to sleep, but they're so upset about a problem they had and just going over and over in their mind about it that's leading to sleep problems. Similarly, we also have shown that emotional cascades may actually contribute to nightmares in borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is actually a disorder that has much more frequent nightmares than the average person, or even people with depression or some anxiety problems. And this has been sort of a mystery, but we think of what's going on is emotional cascades are actually carrying over into the night. What often happens is when someone experiences an upsetting problem, and then they're spending all day being upset about it, is that problem then haunts them again at night. To sort of show this, using our experience sampling data again, we measured how people were feeling during the day and then looked at how they slept that night and if they reported nightmares. And so what you can see here is this bar here is if someone has a BPD diagnosis, they had a rough day and they were thinking about a lot of problems and feeling very upset, they tended to have more nightmares that night as a result. So it's this idea that emotional cascades could even be causing nightmare disruptions in the middle of the night. So with the little bit of time that we have left, I want to highlight what family members can do, because many in the audience have family that are afflicted with this really challenging diagnosis, and as a family member who cares about the individual with borderline personality disorder, it can be very challenging because you want to help them cope with this disorder, but it's also they're very challenging in terms of the way they respond to you and to their emotional states. So one of the key factors I really hope to stress here is that understanding this emotion and the emotion process of borderline personality disorder, that when people with BPD get upset, it's not just because they are making too much of something or because they need to get a hold of themselves. It's because they're experiencing a phenomenon that results in extremely intense emotional responses that are just, when people say, oh, just get over it, they pretty much can't without some extra help. So knowing what's going on reduces negative reactivity in terms of a family member responding to a patient with BPD, and it can improve empathy, even in challenging situations. When you know that the individual is experiencing this extreme response, it helps you give some more empathy and understand that maybe they're trying to control, but it's very difficult. I also think it's really helpful to give this process a name, such as an emotional cascade, because oftentimes when I work with patients, when I discuss this with them, they're like, wow, I always knew something was going on, but I didn't have a name for it. It just seemed like my life was in complete chaos, and I didn't know what was going on. By being able to give it a name, it helps give you something that can be managed. A second point would be to help your loved ones distract when upset. So I covered a number of different activities that could be used to help people distract from upsetting emotions. But it's also, as a family member, it can help to really encourage them to engage in those activities. So you work with them to come up with different activities that they can do, that they'll enjoy, and that are easily accessible to them. And another thing that can be helpful is to develop what's called a coping card. And this is often like a little list of activities that are right there in front of the person that they can do. Because when people are very upset, they're easily distracted, they easily forget their strategies. So by having either a physical coping card that's written down on a piece of paper, or maybe it's written down as a reminder in a smartphone app, or even just telling someone these different activities they can do can help sort of give someone some options when they're feeling really upset. Finally, as a family member, it's really important to try not to get frustrated. And that can be very challenging. As a clinician working with patients with BPD, often as a clinician it can be very challenging not to get sort of frustrated with someone when they're responding in an emotional way to something I said that was sort of misinterpreted. So I've seen this experience from the clinical end, and many family members report this as a problem when working with their loved one. So the more you can try not to get frustrated, the more it can help. When we get frustrated, we often make things worse with the patients. We can say things that we didn't mean to be hurtful or didn't mean to say, but we ended up upsetting them even worse. So if you don't get frustrated, that helps decrease the feeding into that sort of cycle. And the other thing that's important to remember for family members and clinicians is that when individuals with BPD are building emotion regulation skills, that takes time. It's not done with just one or two skill uses. It's done with multiple skill uses per day, for months, and sometimes even for a few years. But the more people practice using those skills and the more they utilize those skills, the better they're going to get at it and the better they're going to be able to manage these intense emotional reactions. So there's a lot of hope for people with borderline personality disorder, and our treatments are showing to be very effective. But that's something that we, as researchers of the disorder and as well as researchers of treating the disorder, continue to work on to help anyone, including the people with the disorder, as well as the families. So with that, I want to go ahead and acknowledge funding that I've received for this research from a variety of organizations, including the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation with a Young Investigator Grant, the Families for Borderline Personality Disorder Research, National Institute of Mental Health, and the Neil S. Jacobson Award for Outstanding and Innovative Clinical Research from the Association for Cognitive and Behavioral Therapies. Down here, I've got my contact information with my email address. You're more than welcome to email me if you had a question you'd like me to try and answer, or if you just wanted to let me know anything that you think might be helpful. And then I've also got listed my website here that you're more than welcome to visit, and you can download many of the papers for this research that we've been doing. So I'll just click on that. There it goes. So here you can see my website, and if you just come over here to Lab Publications, we have a list of a variety of publications, and publications that are listed here in blue are downloadable right off the internet. If there's something you're interested in that's not highlighted in blue, you can just email me, and I'm happy to send a copy of that to you as well. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and open the floor for questions.
Great. Eddie, thank you very much. You took some complex, complicated issues and were able to explain it in a way that's very user-friendly and engaging, and I think really can be helpful to people, both people who have borderline personality disorder and also family members, friends, clinicians who want to help people that have borderline personality disorder. One of the things that a couple of people asked has to do with childhood, and are there any identifiable early signs of BPD in childhood, and then along with that, if so, any research or suggestions in terms of preventative measures for high-risk children?
That's a fantastic question. And first I'll start by saying is it used to be thought that borderline personality disorder was only relevant to adults, but we're finding more and more that the signs of borderline personality disorder become more visible in early adolescence. So working with teenagers on a lot of these skills is definitely an important thing to do if you've got someone you think might be sort of on the path to developing this disorder. There are some signs in early childhood that can lead to this disorder, is if you've got a child that seems to just have problems sort of regulating their emotions, even at a young age, that increases risk for the development of this disorder. So the more you can help children and young adolescents and young adults learn to regulate emotions and to understand emotions and help find healthy ways to cope with those emotions, the better chance you are going to be of reducing the risk for development of this disorder.
Are there, for people who have developed the disorder, sometimes it can be difficult for family members to get them engaged in treatment. Any suggestions as to how to get somebody into treatment when the family sees that need for their loved one?
That's a fantastic question, and one of the biggest challenges for not only borderline personality disorder, but for a variety of mental health conditions, because oftentimes our society has a very stigmatized view of therapy. But I would say first that we actually did a study on this that showed about, on average, about 50% people in any given year with BPD are interested in seeking treatment, but only about 20% of those actually reach out and go get treatment. And what I think often means is that percentage that's interested in treatment but doesn't pursue it is often kind of scared or worried about what treatment involves. So my recommendations for this would be is if you have been speaking to a loved one and you have been trying to encourage them to get treatment, is to first let them know that we have successful treatments that can help them learn how to manage their emotions in a healthy way. As I mentioned earlier, dialectical behavior therapy has been shown to be very effective and very helpful for most people with borderline personality disorder, in addition to the other treatments. Now, if they still wouldn't be interested in going into treatment with an individual provider, another recommendation might be to have them search for some smartphone apps that are involved with helping regulate emotions online. Our lab has been working on this sort of for a while, although it's a challenge in terms of the climate to get one of these apps built. But what we've found is that the more people use apps to monitor their emotions and their thoughts, the better they are at managing them and avoiding problem behaviors as a result of those emotions. So even if the individual were to use a smartphone app that's involved with sort of emotion regulation skills, that might give them some help and might encourage them to further develop those skills in clinical settings with a provider.
All very good suggestions. One of the areas of questions relates to medication. You've really spoken, I think, very eloquently about DBT, about the fact that there are other forms of treatment that have been proven to be effective, and you really spoke about how, in some ways, how DBT works in the context of the research that you've conducted. I'm curious about use of medication on its own or along with DBT or other effective therapies.
That's another great question. Well, first, I want to state that I'm actually a big fan of using both medication and psychological treatment, as in most cases, that's what provides the best effect for patients with a variety of conditions. The problem with borderline personality disorder is that we haven't actually identified a medication that specifically helps, and consistently helps those with borderline personality disorder. So there's no one medication that can necessarily be recommended for borderline personality disorder. But what can be really helpful is that oftentimes people with borderline personality disorder are anxious, or they're depressed, or having some other conditions, and that can be where it can be really helpful to get medication. So in a case where somebody maybe had a co-occurring diagnosis of depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder, those would be scenarios where medication would likely be very helpful, but it might not necessarily treat this emotional reactivity that you see in borderline personality disorder. We're still, as a research field, looking to identify more helpful medications that specifically help with BPD and self-injury, but unfortunately, right now we sort of have to rely on standard antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications and hope that those might get some effect as well.
You spoke about the issues related to self-injury type behavior. I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit about the important issue of suicide and suicide prevention for people with borderline personality disorder.
That's a fantastic question. So as I noted before, people with both self-injury and with borderline personality disorder are at much higher risk for suicidal behavior, and that includes suicidal thoughts or ideation, suicide attempts, and actual death by suicide. In terms of preventing that, there's a number of steps that both clinicians and family members can take. And the first one would be is to take any sort of indication of suicidality seriously. There's a sort of stigmatization and a misbelief for borderline personality disorder that people with this disorder fake suicidal behavior and attempts. And I can't emphasize enough that that is incorrect. When someone with borderline personality disorder expresses that they're feeling suicidal, they very much mean it, and they often want help but don't know what to do about it. So take any sort of indication of suicidal ideation or thoughts very seriously. Don't dismiss it for sure. The other thing that can help is if you suspect this, but the individual hasn't actually said anything about it, is to just ask them. Study after study has shown that if you ask somebody who's suicidal if they're feeling suicidal, they feel better because it shows that somebody cared enough to ask them, and they often want to tell someone, but they're very afraid to. So don't be afraid to ask, and to constantly, as much as needed, check with your loved one or your individual in treatment to see if they're feeling that way, because the more we can monitor it and help someone who's coping with it, the better their outcomes will be.
I think that's a very important point that you're making about asking someone. I think sometimes people feel that by asking the question, it may give the idea, where evidence is that by asking the question, you're actually encouraging the person to get help and not suffer in silence.
Exactly. Don't worry about them becoming suicidal because you asked, because all the evidence suggests that that doesn't happen. What it does suggest is that the individual will respond much more favorably than in a negative way.
And I want to ask you about ways that family members can get support for themselves so that they can do a better job supporting their loved one.
That's a great question, and one I hadn't thought as much for. But to sort of put this in perspective, dialectical behavior therapy has a component where the treatment providers working with people with BPD meet on a regular basis to work on not only how can they do better, but sort of provide support for each other, because oftentimes the sort of emotional chaos of this disorder can be a challenge for both families and clinicians to deal with. So I think that's why it's good to look into contacting organizations like the Families for Borderline Personality Disorder Research and having contact with people who are going through the same situation and who are struggling with the same problems for their family members, because it can be a challenge, and the more we can support each other as clinicians and families, the better we can help those who are afflicted with the disorder as they try to improve and get a hold of a very challenging condition.
One of the issues has to do with the HIPAA laws and family members of adults, whether it be a sibling or a child, and interactions with their healthcare professionals. Do you have any suggestions with regards to how does a family get involved in the treatment of their loved one?
Well, I think that the best approach there would be to, especially if the patient is an adult, to ask the individual if they would like to have you be involved, whether that would involve coming to some of your treatment sessions or some of the patient's treatment sessions, or even having the provider sign a release form that allows the provider to speak with family members about the treatment. But if someone's an adult, unfortunately, it's sort of up to the patient to decide if they want family to be involved or not. And this is sort of a struggle where I've worked with patients who their families have contacted me wanting to know about the patient's progress and wanting to help out, but the patient has been reluctant to involve the family. And in that case, as a provider, all I can do is work with the patient and encourage them to reach out to family for support. But I can't go beyond that. So that's why I think it's important to sort of make it clear with the patient that you want to help them. And then if they are interested in that, making sure that you've both connected with the clinician to make sure that the appropriate release forms have been signed to have you involved in the treatment.
Very, very good guidance. Eddie, I want to thank you so much, first of all, for taking the time to have such an outstanding presentation, and second of all, for the work that you've done to improve the understanding and the treatment of borderline personality disorder. It certainly gives a tremendous hope to people with BPD and to their loved ones to know that you and others are conducting research to improve the care of people. So thank you very much.
It's absolutely my pleasure.
Good, thank you, thank you. I also want to thank all the people who joined us today. All of the research we fund is made possible through private donations. So if you'd like to make a gift, please visit our website at bbbrfoundation.org or call 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you missed any portion of the presentation or would like to share it with a family member or friend, please visit the webinar page at our website. I hope you'll join us again next month when Dr. Nora Volkow, Foundation Science Council member and Director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse at the National Institute of Health, will talk to us about addiction. This will take place not on a Tuesday, but on a Wednesday, and it will be Wednesday, August 19th at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. I hope you'll be able to join us then. Once again, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.